and to personalize it a lot more than the other book, and to change the language. If you know anything about French existentialism, it has kind of, I mean, logotherapy is actually, the original thing was called From Death Camp to Existentialism by Viktor Frankl. And Wiesel picked up a lot of that. And so God's silence is kind of the challenge that existentialists were wrestling with. And how do you create a meaningful God in a world which seems meaningless, and which suffering seems meaningless? And that's kind of the core, at least to the early Wiesel, who grows. He ultimately, in one of the books, he talks about, we have to become our own messiahs. Human beings are capable of terrible things. God's not going to help us. We have to take this on ourselves to prevent these things from happening. But the book is very different. And when you look at the book, and again, I look at the comments that especially younger readers make when they read the book, and that others have made, is that religious emphasis is one of the attractive things. Wiesel has a big Christian reading. They like him because he deals with these theological issues. As one person, Christopher Layton, Presbyterian minister, has written, where Jews find evidence of God's absence, Christians discover in the midst of anguish and darkness a confirmation of God's redeeming presence. And some of the reviews that I read by readers' comments tell me that that's how they're understanding night. Though more say, you know, it's just this horrible thing, a terrible thing, and the son can't ultimately be entirely faithful to his father in the last moment. But it's a powerful book, and it's clearly, it's just so readable, so much more readable than Primo Levi, that it will remain on the list. One of the surprises for me in doing this list, most recent, well, the Diary of Anne Frank is no surprise. And that's been, again, a regular. It keeps on appearing. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. I mean, one, it was, in fact, you should note this, of the three books I've talked about, with the exception of Maus, all of them came out in either in the 1950s or in 1960. And as Holocaust scholars, you know, there's this whole thing. No one talked about the Holocaust. No one was interested in the Holocaust until the Eichmann trial in 1961. It's just not true. And there are a number of these books that are very successful, the Diary of Anne Frank being the most important, but certainly The Wall in 1952 about the Warsaw Ghetto, Hersey's The Wall, Gerda Klein's book, which is still very successful, comes out in 1954. And so there are people writing, there are people reading about the Holocaust in the 1950s. And of course, the most famous of these is the Diary of Anne Frank. Now, why do people read the Diary of Anne Frank? They read it, if you read the comments, they certainly read it about the Holocaust, but one of the things the Diary of Anne Frank does is it spares us the horrors of the Holocaust. We know something terrible is happening, and talks about it, but we don't know the specifics. And instead we focus on this remarkable adolescence and living in this kind of pressure, pressure cooker with her parents and other people. And if you read again the comments, when the movie came out, when the book came out, and though there's always the mention of this is about tolerance, and this is about what happens when people get persecuted, many more of the comments are about Anne's first love. Teenagers write about Anne's relationship with her parents and how fraught it is, and about Anne's optimism. I still believe people are good, good at heart, which is how the movie ends in 1959, and also how the play ends. Now, why was this? Partly it's because of Otto Frank. The diary was a much more complex document. Anne had a lot of time on her hands. She wrote 3 different drafts of the diary. Some of you may have the critical edition. It's over 1,000 pages long. Her father decided there were certain things he had to cut out. Some of that was personal about some of the people who were in there. He didn't want those things to come out. Some of it was about Anne's sexuality, which is much more explicit in some of the drafts than in others. Some of it was about her despair that she had, and he cut those things out. And he also made a point, he didn't want, some of you may know the dispute between Meyer Levin, the author, and Otto Frank. Meyer Levin, very early on, wrote a radio play based on the Diary of Anne Frank, which came out in 1952. In fact, the first television show about Anne Frank is 1952 on one of the Sunday morning Jewish shows that used to be very common. What was called the Sunday morning ghetto. All the religious shows would be, including Jewish shows, would be every Sunday morning. And there was a documentary about Anne Frank in 1952. Well, here you have Meyer Levin writing this book, and he wants, Meyer Levin was in Israel, covered the liberation of camps, covered people trying to get to Israel. He wanted Anne to be a Zionist, a confirmed Zionist. He wanted her to be tougher and to emphasize her Jewish identity. Otto Frank wanted exactly the opposite. He wanted it to be a universal story. And so instead of hiring Meyer Levin to write the play, he hired two very popular authors who had success in Hollywood and movies. And they changed a lot of things. The most famous being the line that's both in the play and the movie, where Anne says, she said, in the original, she says, Jews have suffered for such a long time. We have to deal with this and why we've been persecuted. That gets changed to all people, so many people have suffered over all time. There's all these kinds of Americanizations that occur. But I think that's one of the reasons that this was so popular. Anne was the girl next door. Kids could identify with her. I found a piece written by a high school teacher in 1956 in Georgia who had her kids read the Diary of Anne Frank. And she said, I think they're understanding how Blacks are treated. The story was to be universal. Well, let's give you a little of Otto Frank, because he talks about the emphasis on the relationship of children with their parents. And then he talks about the necessity of universalizing the story, not seeing it. He doesn't say not seeing it just as a Jewish story, but it's implicit. So let's run that, Jeff. I guess I skipped Elie. That's okay.
Oh, I am. You don't want to.
Let's skip Elie.
Okay.
We have the lecture hall, and we have our recreation room, and there we want to get people in contact with each other. We have a lot of discussions. This summer it started only about problems of peace, about tolerance, about anti-Semitism, about the Arab-Israel question, about all sorts of international discussions, because people are interested in what is going on. Youth want to know. It is the answer, our idea and our aim to get people to understand each other. No, if they are black or white or yellow, if they're Catholic or Protestant or Jews or Muslims, whatever, we have to live in one world, and as long as we don't know each other, there are misunderstandings. The more people we get here in contact with each other, who more they try to understand each other and to understand that we are different, but that we could get along very nicely. I don't think anyone wants war. No population wants war, and we have to discuss all these questions. Of course, it's only a little part of people we can get here, but every little thing helps. We have to try. We have to do our duty.
We missed there's a part there in which he talks about how what he learned from Anne's diaries, not so much about the Holocaust, but how little he knew his daughter and how little parents really know the internal workings of the minds of their children, and that's what he thought the strength of the diary was. And so it will continue to resonate, and some of you may know there's been a whole number, now there's this whole new book that is in the top, in one of the, is fairly highly ranked in the sales right now, about who discovered Anne Frank and who betrayed her, and arguing it with someone on the Jewish consul who actually gave the police. It's been challenged, by the way. A lot of people who know more about this than I do say they don't think the evidence is very strong. But in any case, Anne Frank is going to continue to be one of the most popular. And I suspect I just read a book on called Holocaust Cinema Complete, in which he talks, there's been like almost 20 movies. She is the most recognizable figure of the Holocaust, is Anne Frank. And she will continue because we can identify with her. A book that surprised me that's entered on here, but then it doesn't surprise me in some ways, is Markus Zusak's The Book Thief. It has appeared, partly this is because it was a big budget film, but that film was long ago and it's still doing it. It's one of these books that gets assigned a lot in school. And I think that's the key to its success. But it does something, it's a later book, and it does something that no book that touches on the Holocaust could have done earlier. It's kind of normalizes the German situation. Zusak is a descendant of Germans. He talks about his parents talking about what happened during World War II and about their deprivation and their being bombed. And if you know The Book Thief, though there is a Jewish story in there in which they hide a Jew who teaches the young girl to love books, the story ends up veering in much more into what it was like to be Germans under bombardment, into suffering. And it's about, it's also very typical young adult fiction. It's been called The Holocaust Meets Harry Potter, because as you know, death is the narrator of the book and plays a large role. And so I think that popularity is partially, it's broadening the victimization of World War II. And not one of my favorite books, and one that clearly, but when Zusak, I was going to play you a Zusak clip, but I decided not to take some, but basically he says, I was shocked to hear about what happened to Jews, but what I was really interested in was my parents telling me these stories of ordinary civilians in bomb shelters and dying and whatever. And for some reason, that's popular. I'm not sure. But what it tells us, because the Diary of Anne Frank is the most assigned, certainly the most identifiable figure, and has usually been introduced to kids by 6th grade, 7th grade. It's my first exposure to the Holocaust, I know, is that so many of these books are children's books. 3 of the 10 books I'm talking about are children's books. And how do you make this palatable to younger readers? And this is, I know we have someone here from the Butterfly Project. It's a real issue. I think we, especially when kids are 12 or 13, we underestimate what they can take and what they've seen already, and we treat them like snowflakes. But earlier kids, I do think it's a concern. And so the next book, Number the Stars, how many of you know Number the Stars by Lois Lowry? This is for younger readers, and it's a positive story. Though it has a few frightening moments and some people do die, but it's about the German occupation of Denmark and a young girl whose best friend is Jewish. And they start realizing that they learn ahead of time, which the Danes did learn ahead of time, that the Germans are going to conduct a raid and deport everyone. And so the Danes gather together to hide. And of course, the parents of this girl take her parents, her girlfriend and her girlfriend's parents in and help them get onto a boat to go to Sweden. It's a very, very positive story. And let me just get to the section on this. Here we go. In Number the Stars, she focuses on this uplift. It's an uplifting story. Now, the question is, I'm working on this right now. This was something that came up in the last time. There's a big debate over how early you should start teaching the Holocaust. There are proponents who say K through 4. You can certainly teach prejudice reduction, empathy, and Number the Stars is certainly a book that's taught as early as 4th grade. And it's to help, as one teacher says, written again as a comment, to help my students learn to be rescuers and not bystanders. Conversely, others say it is inappropriate to teach this material to children so young, but the comments posted by juvenile readers of Number the Stars on the Barnes & Noble and Amazon websites indicate to me that some students are mature enough to understand it and they get the story, and others miss it entirely because they see it as just an exciting story about friendship and how you can't break the bonds of friendship. One of my colleagues, a woman, she's an educational anthropologist who goes into classrooms and studies what's going on. She's written a book about Holocaust education. This is Simone Schwaber. She writes about one teacher who was using it, and then the questions her students asked, and some of those questions were really good, and other questions were like, who took care of their pets when the Jews were taken away? Not the main question, but this is a 4th grader dealing with the material, who took care of their pets. So it's, again, a positive story for the kids market. But there's another market out there which Holocaust scholars have generally ignored. I call that the Evangelical Holocaust. And the niche carved out by Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place. How many of you have read Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place? How many of you have heard of Corrie ten Boom? Not many. I can't see everyone on here. Let's see if anybody else. Raise your hand if you've heard of Corrie ten Boom. Two out of you have heard of Corrie ten Boom. I would argue Corrie ten Boom is the best known Christian figure of the Holocaust. Far better, maybe Pius XII. I think more people know about her than Pius XII. And the reason is she viewed the Holocaust, and there's a whole genre of these Holocaust memoirs by believing Christians who helped Jews who ended up in concentration camps and who used this experience to say, terrible suffering, but I stayed with God, I continued to believe in Jesus, and I got through it because of my belief in Jesus. And that's what Corrie ten Boom, and her family was remarkable. They hid many, many Jews in their homes. Her brother was the head of a branch of the Dutch Reformed Church to convert Jews. Her grandfather had been that, but out of that conversion, they were Calvinists. They had this strong sense of biblical kinship to Jews. She mentions when the Germans first come in and they're trying to, they're passing special legislation, and her father, who used to run groups to convert Jews as well, says they can't do that. Don't they know Jews are the apple of God's eye? They really believe in this idea of chosenness and that as a Christian responsibility, and they are fundamentalists in this, to take care of Jews. My own work has been about Holland with rescuers before I started studying movies and books. In Holland, there's what are called the Christian Reform movement, and the Reform movement. There's the Dutch Reform movement, which is the mainstream, but then there are the breakaways, who were the fundamentalists and who broke away in the 19th century because they didn't like the way the church was becoming too liberal. And they constituted 8% of the population of Holland and 25% of the rescuers of Jews. So something, the Corrie ten Boom story has a lot behind it in terms of historical truth. These Christians, they had very strong networks. They had political networks, social networks. They helped Jews because it was almost, I interviewed many of them, and they would always quote me the same passages in the Bible about why they had to help Jews, usually from Paul from Romans 11:13, where Paul condemns the Jews, contemporary Jews, for not believing in Jesus, but then says, but God never reneges on his covenant. And they still are the chosen, and they will eventually be redeemed, of course, when they convert. And that's the appeal of Corrie ten Boom. Now, just to give you an idea of Corrie ten Boom, how popular she is, the book was originally written in 1954, called A Tramp for God. She became an international evangelical preacher. And it wasn't a hit then, but then Billy Graham met her, and he was really impressed, and he had it rewritten by two very popular authors, John and Elizabeth Sherrill, and was republished in 1971. 4 years later, he made a feature film with big stars in it called The Hiding Place. And since then, it is a core feature. If you are looking at homeschooling, if homeschoolers are teaching about the Holocaust, they're doing it through Corrie ten Boom. If you are looking at parochial schools, at least Catholic, not Protestant ones, they're teaching it through Corrie ten Boom. Let me give you, I mean, the problem with this is, of course, how do you separate the evangelical message, which is in the movie and in the book, from the rescue of the Jews, and seeing that as the main story. And I want to show you Pat Robertson interviewing Corrie ten Boom. And notice how quickly he skips from this is about the Jews to it's about her faith. Why don't you run it?
Sorry.
You might have to skip. I didn't do Lois Lowry, so you'll probably have to skip her. There she is.
And you've been there, and you know there was no. Was His grace always sufficient? There was never.
You got to
a
start
time
it at the
His grace was
beginning,
not
Jeff.
sufficient for you.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you got to start it at the beginning. And then run it to
So delighted to
158.
have you back with us on the 700 Club. We appreciate you so much. You know, as we were talking before, perhaps some of the people who are watching now were not familiar with your experience when, as I understand, you were hiding Jewish people in Holland. Yes. And the Nazis, the Germans, took you and because of this and put you into prison.
Yes.
And how long were you in the prison?
I was 11 months a prisoner. First 4 months in solitary confinement, alone in a cell, and then in a concentration camp in Holland, a German concentration camp, and then in Ravensbrück, the terrible place north of Berlin. And that's where my sister died.
She died there.
Yes.
And in that time, God somehow kept you sweet and tender towards Him. How did you do it? How did you keep from being just terribly despairing? What kept you buoyed up at this time?
That's good what you have. What kept you? Who kept me up?
Who kept you?
I can tell you, there are circumstances that you cannot do anything, and it was only the Lord who has carried me through, and it is so good that I have experienced that. Mm-hmm. For I had always believed. Now I know from experience that Jesus' light is stronger than the deepest darkness.
Praise God.
And a child of God cannot go so deep, always deeper are the everlasting arms that carry you.
It matters not how dark it is. No. His light is always
greater. Yes, the devil is strong, but his power is limited, and Jesus' power is unlimited.
And you've been there.
You can stop there. Anyways, you can imagine what this book means when it's taught as for homeschool or in parochial schools. Again, going back to Simone Schwaber's study, and she studied some classes that were parochial schools. One teacher told her, said, I think Corrie ten Boom's book allows you to become more sensitive to others and have more empathy and compassion for their beliefs. But on the other hand, stressing the literalist Christian message, the teacher portrayed God's initial election of the Jews as the reason why Germany selected them as victims, and the righteousness of ten Boom as the natural response of a true believer and a savior, whose covenant of grace and love for human beings supersedes Jewish legalism and particularism. Students received no instruction on the role of Christian churches and rulers in demonizing and persecuting Jews in European history, and how the majority of Christians and their clerics failed to respond to the plight of the Jews under German domination. All they learn about is the exemplary behavior of the Ten Boom family. So it's a problematic text, to say the least. But I admire her, and I think we often think, well, it would be those liberal Christians who would help Jews, not the fundamentalists. It's not always true. It ran the gamut among Christians, and you can find certain liberal churches which helped, but you find a number of these sort of fundamentalists. The other one, some of you know the story of Le Chambon, a Protestant Calvinist stronghold, which rescued 5,000 Jews in southern France, though there it was a much more progressive Christianity. The book on here that I dislike the most is The Boy in Striped Pajamas. But it is very popular. A recent survey in England showed that 35% of teachers who teach the Holocaust in England assign The Boy in Striped Pajamas. It's one of the most popular movies that's assigned if you're teaching. It certainly is geared as a book for younger readers, but there's a problem with it. And the problem is people ignore what's on the front page, the title page. It says, The Boy in Striped Pajamas, a fable. It's a fable. But when students see the movie where it doesn't say it's a fable, or when you read the book, students believe it's true. And what does that mean? It means that a boy in a concentration camp, a Jewish boy in a concentration camp, could sit down next to the fence with his German counterpart and play games and talk and have a relationship. And that this boy who lived literally hundreds of yards from a death camp would have no understanding of what went on there. That the family of the SS soldier would have no understanding of it. That basically Germans didn't know, only the father, only the SS guy knew. There's a recent study done by the University College of London, says many students after studying the story reached the conclusions that contributed significantly to one of the most powerful and problematic misconceptions of history, that ordinary Germans had literal responsibility and were brainwashed by or otherwise entirely ignorant of the atrocities. In an era of fake news and conspiracy, it's very worrying that young people harbor myths and misconceptions about the Holocaust. And the whole thing about the book is it couldn't have happened. If Shmuel, the young Jewish boy, sat down with a German boy next to the fence, where he probably would have been electrocuted, the guards would have shot them. But in this story, it doesn't happen. And as you know, in the end, the German boy is gassed because they think it's a game that they're playing, and they go into the gas chamber thinking it's still a game and end up dying. The last book is one that hasn't been on ever before. It's a more recent book, Bloodlands, and it kind of is surprising to me, if for no other reason that it's 550 pages long, and usually books that long don't make it on bestseller lists, but also because it represents something new. And I'm wondering, if this is just, I did this the week of March 6th. I'm not sure if I would have done this a year ago if Bloodlands would have been there. Why do I say this? Timothy Snyder is an expert on Eastern Europe, and Bloodlands is about the Holocaust. It's about the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, but it's also about Stalin's atrocities. And he argues, in fact, that there's this corridor of land between what the Germans wanted and what the Russians wanted, or Soviet Union wanted, where ethnic tensions were high to begin with between various groups, and in which two ideologues, Hitler for ideologues and different reasons, killed millions of people. And it was just kind of an arena where this was possible, whether it was Stalin killing millions of Ukrainians in the 1930s by starvation, by deliberate starvation to force them to collectivize agriculture in industry, or whether it was Hitler killing them during the Holocaust. And so he has this broader scope. Now, why is the book so popular now? I think partly because of the Russian thing. I think it will probably fall off the list, but also because Timothy Snyder has become a fixture on TV in the last 2 years. He's written a book on authoritarianism, one of the big critics of what's going on, warning people about what went on with Trump and the kind of shift towards authoritarianism in the United States. He's been a fixture on TV the last 6 months, or however many months Putin has been surrounding Ukraine, giving interviews all over the place. But he also represents something else that you may not be aware of within Holocaust studies, and that is a competition. It shouldn't be a competition, but a competition that's developed between genocide studies and Holocaust studies. And what's called the theory of uniqueness, Holocaust uniqueness. This has been a debate since the 1990s. Is the Holocaust unique and we can't really compare it to any other genocide? Or are there sort of common features? And this has happened before and will happen again. And Snyder belongs to that latter camp. And there are some Holocaust scholars who fear that now they're relativizing the horrific nature of the Holocaust by comparing it. There's a big debate going on in Germany, for example, now that should we study the Holocaust, or should we emphasize it as much, or should we look at Germany's colonial past and what they did in West Africa, where they committed a genocide in Namibia in basically at the turn of the century. And many of the people, by the way, involved in that genocide ended up being commanders, certainly being commanders in Armenia. The Germans served as technical advisors in the Armenian genocide, though they didn't approve of it, they didn't stop it either. And a number of those people end up being important figures in the Holocaust as well. So again, it's your focus, whether you want to view the Holocaust as unique or not. But I think part of this is this kind of broadening of what we consider genocide, and that is represented by Bloodlands, which is an amazing book and definitely worth reading. And I think he makes a very strong case for his point. But now it's being made in terms of European colonialism, treatment of Native Americans, treatment of African Americans, all of which I think, I always say, when people make analogies, I always tell people, similarity does not mean exactly the same. Similarity just means there are certain parallel features, and in certain ways, this is a throwback, because if you know anything about the way the Holocaust was studied in the 50s, it wasn't ignored, but it was always studied as part of totalitarianism. What's Hannah Arendt's great book, The Origins of Totalitarianism? What does she do? She has these big comparisons between Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union. And in a certain sense, we've returned back to that. So let me conclude. We've got an hour here. The perennial best-selling Holocaust books are not necessarily the ones that experts and survivors would recommend as essential reading for those who want to learn about the Holocaust. But it reveals that the institutionalization of the Holocaust in public school curriculum has been a spectacular success, and that courses and curricular units have encouraged a wider variety and diversity of lessons that teachers want their students to draw from the event. Those teaching the youngest students hint at the scope of the catastrophe, but cushion the shock of it by emphasizing how Christians shielded Jews, the befriending, whether that be in The Boy in Striped Pajamas, or whether it be in Number the Stars or in Corrie ten Boom. High school students are exposed more directly to the horrors endured by European Jewry, though sometimes Anne Frank is a way of still buffering that, but certainly the reading of Elie Wiesel and Maus expose them to tougher things. And even, I would argue, The Book Thief the sections on the hiding of the Jewish man are very effective, and there is a section on Kristallnacht as well. But the discomforting actuality is reserved for university students and adults who must grapple with the shattered faith of an Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi's observations on the human condition. And Levi had always been part of this until this most recent list. Now he's down to about 150,000. But the popularity of Frankel and Ten Boom and of all these different kinds of interpretations, whether it be Wiesel's questioning of God, the affirmation of God by Corrie Ten Boom, all of this points out that we are a very diverse society and we will have diverse readings of the Holocaust. As James Young, who writes about Holocaust memorials, once put it, in America, the motives for memory of the Holocaust are as mixed as the population is large. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. It's a terrific lecture, as you always present such in-depth insight. I'm always wondered if you were going to start having an ending song. You always have a beginning song. So I was curious.
By the way, one thing I should mention, other books, the more recent books do enter in, though it is surprising how well these other books last. But if you want to know the 3 books, contemporary books that have made it into the top 20, it's Bill O'Reilly's Killing the SS, Edith Eger's The Choice, and Lucy Adlington's The Dressmakers of Auschwitz. So I don't know what any of those say about, I haven't, Edith I've known for a long time and really respect her a lot. I have no idea what Bill O'Reilly writes. I'm into cancel culture when it comes to Bill O'Reilly, and I don't know much about The Dressmakers of Auschwitz. So maybe someone, if they've read it, can tell us about why it's so popular right now. Yeah, let's open to questions.
Yeah, if there are questions, just raise your hand, and you're all have to unmute yourself. You can all unmute yourself now, but we realize we can't talk over each other.
Yeah, I see Joe has a question, so let me call on Joe. Joe, did you have a question?
Oh, I just
okay.
unmuted myself.
A woman, but her name is Sam. Did you have a question under Sam Landau? But you're obviously not Sam. Unless your name is Samantha.
No, I didn't have a question, but we did read The Dressmakers of Auschwitz in our group. And it's pretty amazing because it's a true story.
Right.
And it is about women who basically were saved because they were making dresses for the Nazi wives, the head Nazi wives. It was good.
It's kind of projecting a positive message, or is it pretty tough and it's
no, it's tough because you really, you think about what these women had to do, and what they were suffering and making these amazing dresses for, the Nazi wives. So no, it was intense. But I have to say, we were reading the Mouse book for our book group and the Generations group. And to me, we've read a lot of books and all of the ones that you've mentioned today. And I thought Mouse was the toughest.
It's a good book, but it has that buffer of it's the animals. It's a cartoon.
Yeah,
I think that's the key to its success.
Yeah, I think that helped, and it's very cleverly done. Yeah. But I think the intensity of what happens within that book was one of the toughest. And I was thinking about kids reading that book, and it's very, very tough.
Yeah.
Joe,
First of all, say hi to Bonnie for me, and for him.
She's in back of the door.
What about the tattooists of Auschwitz?
Yeah, again, I don't know. It's not in the, I just looked at the ones that are the biggest sellers. There's a bunch that are out. Last time I did this was I did one in 2017, and that had a bunch of books that I didn't recognize. which have fallen off. One was, this one about the beasts in Berlin. It's a work of fiction about the American embassy ambassador to Germany in the first years of Nazism. That was on there for a long time, but it's fallen off. There have been other children's books. One of the ones I was surprised that wasn't on here, because it's usually been on here, is The Devil's Arithmetic. Has usually been in the top 10, and that's often assigned as one of the major books in high school. Again, gets criticized because it has this science fiction, kind of young adult fiction vibe to it, with time travel and all that. But yeah, I don't know much about the tattooists.
So I'll have a question for you, because I think we have a lot of authors who are in our group, certainly some authors who are here with us, and you read and are part of the publishing world. How do you see the change of digital self-publishing in how this will affect, because all of our parents, many of us are trying to figure out how to memorialize them in their stories. And certainly we heard from Deborah, who's doing that, and we have others who are doing it as well. So how do you play that out in the future when you can do self-publishing?
Well, self-publishing has, this was a trend though that was happening a lot even before we digitalized. There are so many memoirs, and I think it was opened, in many ways, NBC's Holocaust in the 1970s opened this up in a way that it wasn't true before. And certainly Elie Wiesel played a great, an amazing role in opening this up. So that from the 1980s on, you get, Holocaust survivors weren't necessarily invited to schools to talk about their experiences before the 1970s. This is really a fairly recent phenomenon. It wasn't that there was silence, but the kind of ubiquitousness of the Holocaust, that you use the Holocaust as almost every analogy you make to something bad, whether you're Valerie, whether you're Vladimir Putin or making it for a progressive reason. It's just so well known, and there have been so many memoirs. And one of the things I've noticed with Holocaust books in general is, I think The Dressmakers of Auschwitz is probably a good example. We're focusing now on smaller and smaller tidbits, smaller and smaller subjects that are in certain ways easier to understand. They're not that broad sweep, but they're not the ones that you would have focused on when you're just getting the story out. And that's what having all this foundation of 30, 40, 50 years of Holocaust novels, movies, scholarship allows people to do, is to focus on these lesser known stories like The Tattooist. There's a movie called The Photographer of Mauthausen. That's a documentary I think you can get on Netflix.
Amazon, I think. No, it's on Netflix.
These are all, sorts of things that people wouldn't have even thought about before. And now these stories are coming out. And I think there's also, the fact that we have a generation of survivors who are passing away and they want to get their story out, or certainly their children want to get their story out. I think that's what drove, Spiegelman in the first, when he first undertook this subject, was to deal with, to get his father's story out. And so, it's, I wrote a piece on this a long time ago for the journal Judaism. And I said, it's kind of like a pointillist painting. We knew the contours in each one of the memoirs as a point in that painting. Some of you may remember The Naked City, the series, the crime series, and it always used to begin, there are 6 million stories in The Naked City. Well, there are 6 million stories in the Holocaust, and together they all give us, and they give us different aspects. Yeah, Sam, I noticed Sam has his hand up.
Yeah, I agree with you with that. The idea, I think, of popularity of some of these books, for example, is the personalization of things that
Right.
people can identify. It makes it more real. I mean, you talk about 6 million, what is that? You know, but you talk about 1 or 2, I mean, so it creates, just like you're talking, even in class, right? When you're teaching, you tell stories.
Right.
That captures the interest of
And
everyone.
notice there's only one history book, only one scholarly book on this list. Well, no, it's Bloodlands by Snyder.
Oh.
And until this year, that position had been Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, which does personalize it in a way, even though it's a history. It's what we call micro history. And so you could see individual motives.
I think Gilbert does that too. Yeah.
Gilbert does it too. He
Yeah.
wants, and Gilbert's, by the way, I didn't put this down because I don't know how to handle this in my, but Gilbert's is in the top 20 if you include Kindle sales.
Well, that's an interesting point. 'Cause
Yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to
And I
ask
didn't
you
talk about Kindle at all. Yeah.
I'll get to you in a second, Salt, in a second. But if you started the statistics 20 years ago, when there really wasn't
Yeah.
even an internet,
Right.
and certainly wasn't digital self-publishing, and there certainly wasn't even a Kindle.
Right.
Now that Amazon offers a platform on which you get Kindles for free
Right.
in books, there's a fundamental thought process that has to go back to how you're calculating your number one book, because if it's monetary, and there's a lot of people using Kindles, and Kindles are offered basically downloaded for free through Amazon, it could skew your whole kind of metric while you're doing that. Go ahead.
Well, they do
Wait,
put the
wait.
Kindle sales in there, and the only one that was there solely for Kindle was Gilbert.
Yeah, but the Kindles are now being
The Holocaust.
Kindle. You can download Kindle content for $0.
Yeah,
I-
but he was
I'd like-
the only one who made it. Yeah.
I'd like to follow up though with where you were talking about education and where children should be aware of what's going on. I know, it's a very sensitive subject. And even like some of our members can't really deal with some of the books that we've talked about or the movies that Jeff has shown. So we've been careful about that. But, there are issues of like antecedents, I guess, to some of these things that have happened, like with kids with bullying, for example, and stereotyping and following the crowd, picking on people. And that's what, like Jan, maybe I should change my name to Jan Landau, so she's on more than I am, so they recognize her. But, what they do in the Butterfly Project is at the lower levels of education, that's what they talk about. It things that, like, fourth graders, for example, experience with other fourth graders, in terms of bullying and pushing other kids around and trying to help those that are being picked on and things like that. So, I mean, you don't have to talk about the Holocaust per se, but these are some of the, again, antecedents that occurred in Nazi Germany, before they really death-defying events took place. So
Yeah,
there are
tolerance.
things you can teach.
Yeah. No, you can't teach. And there are books that do. I mean, Terrible Things by Eve Bunting. It's a Holocaust parable where she uses animals basically to illustrate Martin Niemöller's thing. First they came for this group, and then they came for this group, and then there was no one left at the end. And they do it with different animals disappearing. But it's clearly a Holocaust-oriented story, and that's used for younger kids. But I think there are stories that are. There's a movie, the Number on Grandfather's Arm, which lets the grandfather tell his story, but it's not real graphic what he says. It's been made. HBO did a wonderful little documentary about it. Younger kids can grasp this. I mean, I think this is me. I don't teach anymore. I'm glad I don't teach anymore, because I think I would be I don't know if you followed this whole thing with this professor who was reassigned for using the N-word in a class where he was teaching about racism. and trying to teach the power of words and where do these words come, and students felt hurt, offended by it, and he was removed from his teaching position. This is at San Diego State. I think we're too gentle. The world is tougher than that. And I think we can introduce some of these concepts a lot earlier. Again, it depends on the kid. And so you never know, and you have to worry about parents. But if you're teaching, you can say, this is what I'm teaching. You can have a waiver. If you don't want your child to read this, I'll assign something else, or to see this movie. But I think we're a little too, I think of what every kid has seen so much violence if they watch cartoons. If they watch a Looney Tune cartoon, they've seen violence that's horrific. People slapping them around, and they've seen nudity, and they've heard the swear words. And you have to be careful up to a certain age, but I think we overdo it. That's just my point of view. I wrote a letter in behalf of this professor who I don't know at all, and maybe he did terrible things. But I wrote, if I was teaching the Holocaust, my first unit in the Holocaust is the history of Christian anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
How can you study the Holocaust without studying, this history that preconditioned people to view Jews in a certain way and allowed Hitler to use certain images and stereotypes? And I know, and I used to get Christian students who would complain, but they wouldn't get me removed from my teaching position. And I would sit down with them and I'd talk to them and explain it. I hope I explained well, it isn't necessarily what Jesus said, it's what people after him, and particularly people in power, said Jesus said. But I know, I don't know how you get around that. I'm very glad I don't teach anymore at an American university, because I think we've gone overboard. Jeff, you're muted, Jeff. Deborah.
Glad to have Saul's been waiting patiently, so we'll get to Saul first.
Oh, okay. All right. Saul and then Deborah.
Lawrence, thank you. Wonderful presentation. I recently did a Zoom with a class, not only a class, it was the whole middle school in Arizona. I happened to, Jeff mentioned self-publishing. I self-published a book from Bergen-Belsen to Brooklyn. And the English, the head of the English department happened to read my book. And they actually read Mouse. The whole,
Wow.
that was the school's assigned reading assignment.
And what was the grade that they
What?
were? What was the grade that they were in?
8th grade.
8th grade. Yeah, that's what it's recommended at, is 13 and above.
Yeah.
Some people
And
say
anyway,
11.
I was just amazed at how interested the students were, because this is the first time I've ever done this in a like an extemporaneous manner with a classroom, or it was actually an auditorium, and then they had it on speakers in the classrooms, and they were silent and they listened attentively, and they asked many questions. As a matter of fact, after it was over, the head of the English department sent me an email with one of the questions that the student wanted me to answer, and she was very upset that time ran out and she wanted an answer. So I think there's still a real interest in it, and I'm real happy about it, because it's something I think that the world needs to continue to be aware of. And anyway, thank you.
Yeah, and by the way, all the polls that will report, only 40% can name a concentration camp or something. All of them have, when it asks, should this be taught and is it important to teach, overwhelming majorities. So it isn't that there isn't a willingness, it's what gets taught. I mean, I wonder, I'm in the process, and I think Did we talk? I think we talked about the Butterfly Project the last time I spoke. And I've been asked, I was asked to talk for the Miami Holocaust Memorial to teachers. And they said, and I said, well, what grade? And they said, well, it starts in kindergarten in Florida. And there are a number of states, there's about 6 states that start either 4th grade or they start in kindergarten, where they expect you to be teaching something about the Holocaust. So I started working on movies. I've been asked to write an article on movies that you can assign to kindergartners up through 4th grade. And there are some. There are some. And you do soft pedal the violence. You often use the animal characters. But there are some, and it's happening at that level. And I mean, my only fear, and some people say this has happened in Germany, when you require it, and every teacher has to do it, and not every teacher has the same commitment to the subject, does it then become something that's routine and taught kind of, well, it's something I got to get through, and then kids are turned off by the way it's taught. And a lot of German kids, for example, when asked about this, say, God, I've been bombarded with this, I'm bored with this.
So let me ask anybody who's interested in some of the materials that Laurie has presented. I have a document, so you can just touch me on my email. I'll be happy to share with you his syllabus, and I do want to get to you, Deborah, so go ahead, ask her.
Yeah.
First off, I just wanted to thank you for today. What you shared was very, very enlightening and thought-provoking. And I was curious as to maybe what isn't on the list that you view as really important, really important books that should be on the list.
Right. Well, I've said Primo Levi. I prefer Levi over Elie Wiesel, because Wiesel does get involved in all these metaphysical questions of whether God exists, and that's a kind of running theme, and also a kind of survivor guilt. And Levi was a chemist, and he's very analytical, and it's about how do human beings behave, and why do they behave. And I like Primo Levi more than Wiesel for that, but I understand why. I mean, Wiesel, 100 pages, and he has that writing. It's a French writing. It's why I loved Albert Camus when I first started, because it's this writing style that's so clear, and it's not Hemingway, but it's kind of, it's a very understandable writing style. So I understand that very well. I mentioned a book that I was surprised fell off. Ordinary Men, I think, is a brilliant book, and definitely deserves to be read. One that doesn't get mentioned very much, and its author just died recently, is Richard Rubinstein's The Cunning of History. And this is a book I used to assign. It's 100 pages long, and it's about why the Holocaust happened. And it's just brilliant. Richard Rubinstein, in case you don't know the name, was a rabbi who is credited with developing the death of God theology within Judaism in the 1950s. He wrote a book called After Auschwitz. But this book is genius, and it's some of it doesn't work, but it's all about the sort of common things that the Holocaust has with Western civilization. And things, it's so easy to say, well, this is a German thing. So he's a chapter on how businesses make their decisions, not by how it affects people, but by profit margins. And he uses that to describe, why does the company that makes Zyklon B make Zyklon B? And he says, this is just an order. It's just, you wanted this. I'm not interested in how it's going to end. And he goes through each kind of thing about how the sciences have this, about economics. It's just a brilliant book, and very readable, and very disturbing as well. That's a book I like a lot. I like Still Alive by Ruth Kluger. I think is an amazing book, and it's one of the few memoirs that really is done from a woman's perspective. Or so, I mean, there's lots of women's memoirs, but this one is done She's very self-conscious. She taught at UC Irvine for many years, and it's a brilliant book. Like that a lot. History books that there's so many. I mean, I'm looking at my bookcase right now. I should just pick out ones that were important to me, even though some of them are outdated. I think Lucy Davidovitz's book, The War Against the Jews, which is what got me involved in the field. It came out in the 1970s and was a big success. And a lot of her stuff doesn't hold up, but she was a brilliant commentator, a brilliant synthesizer.
Oh, no.
Of course, though it's huge, Raoul Hilberg's book that no one's going to read because in its entirety, because it's 1,000 pages, but it's really the first great history of the Holocaust, the destruction of the European Jews. And it's in a shorter student's edition that you can get that's only about 230 pages long. And he was primarily interested in the bureaucratic nature of the Holocaust. The Sunflower, if people read The Sunflower here,
No.
that used to be on this list, Simon Wiesenthal's The Sunflower. Brilliant. Wiesenthal talks about after the Holocaust, or I forget what, no, I guess it's during that while it's occurring, and he's an inmate, and he gets called to the bedside of a dying SS man who didn't necessarily believe in what he was doing, but did it because it was his job. And he says, I need you to know that I don't hate the Jews and this and that. And I want your forgiveness. Could you forgive me for what I did? Christians would forgive me. And Wiesenthal ultimately decides he can't do it because how can he forgive for a claim? If it was just being done to him, he could forgive, but it's being done to all the Jews. But then the rest of it is this symposium of about 30 major thinkers of what they would have done in that situation. And it's really a great read and a very important book as well. So I tend more towards the history, but I think that one is one that really moved me as well. And a book that was made into a movie last year. It's really a difficult movie to watch. It's a difficult book to read. The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kosinski is really a frightening book, but one that's written with such verve, and there's passages in that will just remain with you forever if you read it. And people questioned him whether he had really been in a camp and whatever, but as a work of fiction, even if it's a work of fiction, it's just amazing.
Is the movie the same title?
Yeah. It was on, I think it was on Amazon for a while. I don't know if it's still there. It's really, it's probably the most graphic Holocaust novel I've ever read. And his theory is kind of a weird one. It's this Jewish boy who gets out and lives with Poles. And what he finds is that the violence that characterizes Polish peasant life is not that different from the violence the Nazis are committing.
So Saul, maybe I can ask you a question. You talked about the audience that you had, which was a young audience. What question most surprised you?
Well, they're distinct, wanting to know what my mother went through, what kind of suffering she undertook. How did she ever survive? Based on what I described, all of her childhood diseases and being just a lone child, being in concentration camp in Auschwitz. And so they bombarded me with many amazing questions, and some of them were rather personal too, about her development. I think I may have mentioned that she lost a period during the Holocaust while being in concentration camp, because the Nazis used to give them saltpeter, which somehow eliminated their menstrual cycle. And so, it was amazing that, they came up with all these questions. And I think in the 8th grade, was I that attentive to the Holocaust in the 8th grade? I don't recall. Maybe it's because I'm too old.
I'll follow that up, Jan, and I now hear that Arlene is with us. I don't know if you can get on the screen, Arlene, or you just can unmute yourself. But are you sensing similar questions as Saul does when you're at that age of 13 or 14?
We just presented to 600 kids, 8th graders the other day. And a lot of their questions were wanting to know how we felt as second gens, how we were different. I'm speaking for my husband, how we were different growing up because of our parents' experiences. Excuse me.
And Arlene?
Yeah, the same thing. They also wanted to know what our parents had gone through. And you question whether, how graphic to be because of their age. But some of them, there were schools or classrooms, I should say, that virtually no questions, and then others that had many questions. So it was interesting. Interesting experience.
Do they ask you about how it affected how your relationships with your parents?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And how did you respond?
Well,
In my particular situation, my mother, and I told them that my mother tried to, make it as palatable as possible, but but when it brought tears to her eyes, it brought emotions to me. And then I realized that some of this stuff is very, very difficult for her to talk about. So it made it a difficult subject for me to discuss with her. But as we got older and when I worked on the book, she was a lot more forthcoming. And, it was like years away from it occurring. So it was easier for her to divulge it to me. So it made it a lot easier. And, it wasn't easy on me, but I think it was easier on her. And she had also done the Steven Spielberg project where she, talked for like 2 hours. And so, she had gotten used to it. And it really was good, I think, therapeutic for both of us.
And Arlene?
okay, I've forgotten the original question. What did you first ask us?
I said when they asked you about how it affected you as a child of your parents, and how did it in your world, how did this whole thing affect you?
Well, I remember before my father passed away, knowing that, that we were different. We didn't quite know why, because they couldn't talk about it. Why didn't we have a family, during the holidays? And why did we go to friends, but we had no grandparents? And my parents were not able to tell us exactly why, but we knew, my brother and I knew that, well, for whatever reason, we were different. Our parents had accents. They came from Europe. They came from Poland. We knew that much. My father would, as I've said many times, would tell us about his family in Poland, his brothers, his sisters, what they did as a family, that kind of thing, but never mentioned the Holocaust. And after my father died and Spielberg started to do the project, my mom still couldn't talk about it.
Mhm.
One thing I wanted to point out is that when we first started doing our presentations and we would talk about what your parent, our parents had gone through, my in-laws, the kids were really sad. And some of them would come up and say, oh, I have a grandparent in Germany, and literally cry and think that they were responsible. And so we had to change it. Our presentation, we did talk about these things, but we always ended up with talking about the people who did what was right, the righteous among the nations, and leaving the kids with hope that if they behave differently, if they were more understanding, if they were kinder, if things that they stand up against bullies at school and how you do this, then something like this won't happen again. To anyone, we have to leave them with hope that things will be different, not just this depressing, horrible time, tragic time, but we have to learn from it. And it's the lessons from the Holocaust that are so valuable to our lives. And one thing that Sonia always mentions about too, is that in regards to your question, is that she had to be a good girl, that she didn't want to bring any more, maybe Joe can discount that, I don't know, but she had to be a good girl so not to bring any more grief to her parents because they had suffered so much. And
go ahead.
Yeah. No,
I
I was
was
just saying.
I was gonna say agency is in kids' books, and the ones that I'm sort of finding for these younger groups, agency, that kids can somehow cope with this, that they're not powerless. So you have a lot of kids' books which are about, some of you may know The Devil in Vienna, is again Doris Orgel's book, is about a young girl helping her Jewish friend. But there's books about Jewish kids. There's a movie called Fanny's Journey. Anybody know Fanny's Journey?
Mm-hmm.
Which is about this young girl helps lead a group of Jewish kids out of France into Switzerland. Agency is really important to give them a sense that the first Holocaust cartoon, they do exist, animated film, is a film called Sarah and the Squirrel. And it does the same thing with this young girl whose parents disappeared. We never see them die, but she comes back to their hiding place. It's been disrupted. Everything's thrown around in the forest, and her parents are gone. She's left alone in the forest, and she becomes friends with the squirrels, and of course, with the animals. But her main thing is she takes a brick out every day out of a bridge, which the German train crosses. They don't even call them Germans. But which the train crosses, and eventually at the end, the trestle collapses. We don't know what happens to her at the end. They don't, and it's by a Holocaust survivor who became actually one of the most popular cartoonists in the world in Australia. But those sorts of messages are also important. The empathy. Tolerance and agency.
And I want to bring to you all of your attention. Laurie presented along with Jeff Dembski, his colleague, which has been recorded, and the recording is available on YouTube, about prejudice in film, predicting prejudice. The title of the program was, but it was about film prejudice. And Jeff brought in the digital side, social media tropes. And I was speaking to Laurie before this started that I felt like after that meeting, I led such a sheltered life. I had no idea what tropes are being presented online. And I think it's well for us to be able to go on and play that on demand and understand what, there was discussions how Fauci has been made out to be Jewish with the long nose of a spigot, and the virus is coming out of it's just, there are real examples there that are amazing for you to be able to look at and realize what's going on in this world. And I grew up with none of that. I didn't have any anti-Semitic touches when I was growing up. I grew up in a very Jewish community, Jewish schools, Jewish, if the high holidays came, no tests were given, because it was so Jewish. So I was, at age 63, my eyes just dropped out of my head looking at, for an hour of that presentation was just unbelievable. So I will recommend you, I can send you, if you have an interest, just ping me, I'll get you. And you can now, all of our programs are on demand and you can see them there. I think Saul was on that program. I think Issy, you were on that program too, weren't you? I don't know. I recall you were on a program too. So, but great program. So any other thoughts before we conclude? We're right at the 12 o'clock hour. Go ahead, Deborah.
I just have one more.
I'm glad to have you with us and contributing. So I'm
Well,
so happy.
thank you. I other than just the topic that was put out, I didn't really understand much about the group or that there's so many children survive. I mean, second generation. So this question really relates to that in the literature, Laurie. What are there books out there that are important, you think influential, important books written by a child of a survivor?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, actually, the first one's Helen Epstein, who I noticed it looks like she has a new book specifically about her parents. But that one, I can't remember the name of the title of the book, but that's the first one I remember. That goes back to the 70s.
I'll tell you, you should take a look at Saul's book, From Bergen-Belsen to Brooklyn. It has gotten terrific reviews from anybody who's read it. And Isser basically put it in the chat too, it says Saul's book, From Bergen-Belsen, a great read.
And Isser has a good book out too, as well, about his father's experiences. There've been a lot.
Yeah.
Deb, thank you for the plug.
I'm always plugging you. That's high five.
You have to put your last name in there too, Saul, so I can.
Well, you can just go on Amazon, you'll find it.
Okay.
I hope you enjoy it. Most people have. I mean, it's amazing the kind of responses that I've gotten. And my cousin, who's a agent in Hollywood, I signed an agreement with her for screen rights. Whether it ever comes to fruition, I have no idea. But
Saul, you should talk to Laurie because he probably has some experience that you can leverage.
I was going to say some other books. Aaron Haas's book on the second generation, HASS. He teaches at Dominguez Hills or the Los Angeles branch of the CSU. And also did a book on survivors. There's a whole bunch. There's a Canadian guy, I'm trying to remember, where they've done a collection. But it's a hot topic now, and a lot of the movies, have been studying movies for about the last 30 years, and there's a lot of good second generation movies as well that are really interesting and worth, we talked about third generation, about Everything is Illuminated is certainly third generation, but there's a number of really interesting movies in which there's one called A Call to Remember, which was a TV movie. I don't know if you still can get it. A lot of Israeli movies have come out about second generation. Some of you, I don't know if you know The Summer of Aviva, Under the Donum Tree, which are two great Israeli movies about dealing with a parent, in Israel, though we'd like to think they accepted Holocaust survivors with open arms. There was a certain suspicion of Holocaust survivors. One, they weren't Zionists. Why were they still living in Europe? And two, they went to their deaths like sheep to the slaughter. And if you survived, you must have done something bad to survive. And this movie deals with another Israeli movie called The New Land, deals with that issue as well. And there's a lot of movies now about Israeli second generation, third generation exploring either documentaries going back to where their parents live, or often exploring the history of their parents, finding out there's hidden things that they don't know. So it's a pretty, if you just put second generation Holocaust survivors as your search word in Amazon, you're going to come up with lots of titles.
Okay, thank you.
I have a movie.
There's even a thing, by the way, just on, in fact, this would be a good speaker for you. I have the book right here. I will show it.
Okay, take notes, Sam.
I'm taking,
Holocaust graphic novels by Victoria Ahrens. And most of these graphic novels are by second generation, third generation. Again, it's the Art Spiegelman syndrome. I can't really deal with this directly. It would be chutzpah for me to write a first person novel about what it's like, but I'll do it through graphic novels. She would be a great person, by the way. And I'm friends with her, Jeff, if you want to feature Victoria. She'd be terrific.
Sign her up, Jeff.
somebody needs to write a book about being a spouse of a generation.
Now that's one I haven't heard, but that's a good one.
Seriously.
Yeah, Dan, get together
If you
with
like
Ellen.
mouse, you would like spouse.
Mouse and spouse.
Mouse and spouse. All right, I'm going to call it, and it was great, Laurie. Thank you again. You are just a terrific sharer of your insights and your 30 years of experience. Thanks all of you, my friends, to come and spend your
want-
Hey, you feel good, Jeff. Feel better.
I want to echo that to Dr. Baron too for your presentation. You generated a lot of ideas and conversation and thinking. So thank you. Thank you, Jeff, for arranging all this as well. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
And thank you all for participating this morning.
Yeah, it's lovely
Thank
that you took some time out of your busy Sunday mornings to join us. Thanks
Thanks,
all of you.
Laurie. Have a good Pesach.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.